Hey everybody, welcome to another video review. Today I'm going to talk about Aladdin, the live action movie. Maybe make it an Aladdin night. I already reviewed the limited edition Genie's Lamp, which I have in my hand, so you kind of get a feel for how big it is. And I'm going to talk about the movie. I saw it just today, and I might bring out one of my Walt Disney Classics collection Aladdin pieces as well, since I'm on the subject. So, sort of again, making it an Aladdin night. This lamp, by the way, is now sold out. Same weekend as the live action movie, did very well this Memorial Day weekend, and I think it sold out online at least probably a few days ago. If you're fortunate enough to visit one of the Disney theme parks, either Paris or I think even Disneyland in Anaheim, they may still have a couple of these available. There's 4,000 total, and they're split across the Disney properties worldwide, as well as the online Shop Disney website, which unfortunately has already gone online. So if you want to check out my review of this lamp, in one of my other videos, you can learn all about that and why, if you want something like this, and again, I learned this through a hard, bitter experience with the Cinderella slipper, you have to kind of keep an eye out a couple months before the movie to snag it before it becomes a hit. So just kind of playing around with this lamp while I'm giving you the review. It's a really, I haven't watched the movie, which just to let you know I really enjoyed. I'm really glad that I got this replica for myself, because it reminds me of the movie, and it is sort of like the one enduring collectible from that movie that you can actually take, the one replica that actually means something. So really cool, and I'm really happy that I got it. So I'm gonna set this lamp down. Let's talk about the movie. There's gonna be spoilers throughout. What did I think of it? I enjoyed it very much. I liked it a lot. I guess you can't really talk about the live action version of Aladdin without at least somewhat discussing the original classic from which it was based. And there's a lot, I at least have a lot of kind of like personal history with it, because I saw it originally in the movie theater, and the expectations for this was really high, because this was the movie that followed Beauty and the Beast, along with The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and then afterward, I think The Lion King came a bit later. These movies were largely associated with the so-called Disney Renaissance, and this was the last movie that any work from the great Howard Ashman was presented. And I don't know. I don't think I was doing reviews actually when the live action Beauty and the Beast came out, but it is my favorite Disney animated film and probably one of my favorite movies ever. And so Howard Ashman, was a really big deal for me, because he's the guy who wrote all the lyrics to the songs. He was the lyricist who did the songs for all of Little Mermaid and all of Beauty and the Beast, and I think half the songs for Aladdin. And not only did he provide the lyrics, but he was one of the driving forces of story for the animation studio at that time. He was in large part responsible, I think, for that Disney Renaissance, along, of course, with the talented animators. And he was, to a very large degree, sort of like he played the role of the John Lasseter for Disney animation at that time, much like John Lasseter played sort of the leadership role and the inspirational role for Pixar. And unfortunately, he did pass away from complications from AIDS. He died before Beauty and the Beast was actually widely released, and he never got a chance to really truly appreciate the success of that movie and how historic it would be. And so I, of course, as a big Beauty and the Beast fan, knew all about that, and I really, loved Howard Ashman's story and lyrics. There is just a unique playfulness. I believe he really was a genius when it comes to both crafting a story, especially told through songs, and also for the way that he could just twist a lyric and write a song. And his words and lyrics were just so clever, so playful, so unique. I mean, to this day, I don't think I ever, you know, have heard lyrics to match what Howard Ashman did. I mean, there are great songs, obviously, but his particular style of genius was so unique. It's just like such a blow to have lost him in the prime of his career when he was just kind of getting into his groove, and to have lost basically a generation of potentially magnificent movies that could have been. Again, just imagine losing John Lasseter right after Toy Story 1 or something like that. And this will give you a small hint of the magnitude of the loss. And if you are interested in that, you know, there are certain documentaries. There was one, I forgot the name of it. I saw it about 8-10 years ago, that sort of documented the rise of you know, the Disney Renaissance and the work that went behind the scenes to create things like Little Mermaid all the way up through Lion King. But I knew a lot of that, of course, already. If you're a big fan of Beauty and the Beast, you would know who Howard Ashman was. So Aladdin is kind of special because it's you know, he worked on a few songs before he passed. Because as you understand, when you're making movies, you're working on the next project simultaneously while you're finishing up the one before, and so there's a lot of, you know, work that goes on simultaneously. So there was that, and I also remember watching the movie, and at the time at least, I clearly felt the difference in quality between the lyrics that Howard Ashman created for his songs versus the ones that Tim Rice was brought on to finish off the movie. And now I think history judges a little bit more kindly. I think, you know, A Whole New World obviously is one of the great love ballads. You know, it's an iconic love song, a love ballad, and it is wonderful. And I think, you know, it's right up there with, you know, again, some of the greatest love songs written. But in terms of the lyrics, I felt at the time in the 90s when I watched it, so soon after coming off of Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid, that the lyrics just weren't quite as, you know, again, didn't quite have the genius that Howard Ashman, you know, kind of brought to his work. So with that background, you know, I watched Aladdin, the animated picture, for the first time in, like, I would say 15, 20 years with my 10-year-old daughter the night before, and just was sort of to be reminded again of you know, how great that movie is. It's still timeless. It's still considered a great classic. And, you know, it was a great success. I mean, when it first was released, I think in 1992, 93, or thereabouts, I mean, it made $500 million worldwide, which was amazing. And it made another $400 to $500 million when it was released on home video and DVD. So there's a huge, you know, fan base for this. So with that as background, to kind of remind myself of what the original animated feature was, we walked in, you know, and saw the live action movie. So before getting, again, into the details of why I enjoyed Aladdin so much, I'd like to go backward and sort of talk about Disney live action to begin with. I think the attitude of a lot of critics when they are addressing these live action movies from Disney is always to ask, well, why would you want to do that? You've already presented one version of the tale through the animated classics, so what is the point of doing it again in live action when you're essentially just retelling the entire story beat for beat? What's the point? And I think it does contribute to some of the less than stellar Rotten Tomato scores when you canvass the official critics who are doing that type of work. But as a Disney fan, I have a very different perspective than the critics. I think that there is a role for live action and does have tremendous value, even if it does essentially mimic the story. And let me explain. I feel like having a 2-hour live action version of an animated classic, if done correctly and done well, I think you can create or craft something that does bring something extra to the table and may in some ways even add to the story or make the story better in some respects. With that in mind, I think my favorite live action adaptation still remains the one for Cinderella, mainly because having seen the original Cinderella multiple times, I still feel like the original, while it's a classic, is a little bit weak, and I don't think has quite the applicability for adults. I mean, I know that children love it, but when you're watching it, I encourage you, of course, to watch it again from beginning to end. Truly watch all of it. I mean, Cinderella is such a well-known story. Everybody has seen parts of it, but watch it from beginning to end, and you'll realize that the story is actually pretty basic. The characters are rather simple archetypes. Even Cinderella herself, there's not a whole lot to her. She basically demonstrates one particular trait, and a large part of the movie is sort of like padding with animal jokes. It's like cat and mouse. Basically, I'm fond of saying this. It's like basically Tom and Jerry. It's like a Tom and Jerry cartoon, like intercut with the story of Cinderella, and the live action one brought so much more to the table. Kenneth Branagh, of course, has a Shakespearean background, directed it with such sumptuous visuals, amazing, mind-blowing costumes, and then also gave a little bit more depth to the characters to give you a little bit more understanding than some of the more cookie cutter, sort of cardboard type depictions from the cartoon or the animated feature. So what I'm looking for, in a way, for a successful live action adaptation of the original is the following. I don't actually want too much of the story or the characters to stray from the classic in general. I love the original animated features for a reason, and I want to feel safe and I want to feel comfortable watching this story unfold. So no reason to try to reinvent the tale too much unless you really want to take it in some dramatic direction. But in general, don't mess with the story. At least for me. But then I want you to layer the story with greater depth. Give me a little bit more character background, more character motivation. Give me a more complicated story arc that can really only be addressed in a 2-hour film versus a 90-minute animated motion picture. Animation is very, very expensive, especially at the time when they were doing it. Computer graphics weren't really used to the same extent as it is today, especially with Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. Little Mermaid, I believe, was all pretty much completely hand-drawn, and even Beauty and the Beast only used a computer graphic animation in very small pieces, most notably in the ballroom scene. So you can't go as in-depth when you have a 90-minute animated feature. The extra 30 minutes, that's a huge amount of extra time from a movie point of view, and a live action version, I would like to take advantage of that extra time. In addition, I would like to see them take advantage of the live action part where you can create more cinematic action sequences. You can create greater detail. You can never, ever animate something, in my opinion, that can approach a Sandy Powell, Oscar-nominated Sandy Powell costume design that she did for Cinderella. It just can't be done. Like the breathtaking dress when she shows up to the ball, the way she changes into that, that's like amazing. And again, it's an example of what modern day effects and computer graphics and costumes can then add that animation cannot provide. Okay, so that's sort of an example of what I'm looking for. The added sort of effects, the sumptuousness, the cinematic sequences, and then the depth of character and increased character arc. A great live action adaptation is going to add those layers to an already classic story, which means I don't want them to get rid of Jafar. I don't want them to sort of all of a sudden give Jasmine a sword and like a horse. I don't want any huge deviation. I still want the story I love, but just more of it with greater depth and just greater beyond the greater depth, but just also more beautiful, right? Just more of it. So with all of that put forth here as background, I think this picture this live action adaptation of Aladdin really fulfilled a lot of that. This movie is incredibly difficult, I think, to do for a lot of reasons, mainly because you have at the heart of it the Robin Williams problem, which is that Robin Williams gave there's no other way to really say it. I mean, he gave a legendary performance. Now, his performance as a genie is the stuff that's made a legend. And that is what essentially made Aladdin the movie that it was and still is. And so the shadow of Robin Williams is going to be over this movie. And the movie has to rest on the strength of the genie as a character and the genie's performance. And so I think replacing Robin Williams with Will Smith was a huge gamble. I mean, it was either a stroke of genius or it was going to be a disaster. And I think either possibility it's a coin flip, right? Either possibility was out there. And the initial trailers, I think, wasn't the greatest. I think it hit a lot of what was great about the movie. But having seen it, I can tell you that I think personally that Will Smith did a fabulous job. And they changed up enough of it to make his performance his own. He didn't come off as just copying Robin Williams, which would have been a disaster. But he didn't do that. And that would have been, it was really hard to do because he had to sing the same songs. The story beats are the same. And so, you're kind of there doing his thing. But I think Will Smith did a really, really good job making the role his own and creating his own interpretation without giving you uncomfortable reminders that he was trying to ape or copy again Robin Williams' performance too much, which would have been impossible. So, as an overview, this movie I think did everything I wanted a live action retelling to do. So it gives you the story of Aladdin without much deviation. They cleaned it up a little bit to make it a little bit more politically correct. They gave Jasmine a bit more character beats. They had her, sing an extra song or two. I don't think none of the extra song they gave her was nice. I think it did showcase Naomi Scott's singing ability, but I think it wasn't really critical and it wasn't very memorable, for better or for worse. But they gave, again, the overall story, making it a little bit more politically correct, but then they gave added depth and they changed a few things to take advantage of the extra runtime. So just off the top of my head, a lot of the changes that they made to the story that I enjoyed. Number one, they framed the story with the genie telling the story. And I spoil right from the beginning. The genie tells a story actually as a human being, as a man. I think that was really, at least for me personally, that was a huge improvement over the original animated classic. Because in the animated classic, of course, Aladdin sets the genie free at the end of the story. But because it's a shorter movie, the decision for Aladdin to set the genie free kind of played out more like what you would expect like a cartoon to play out, with sort of like a Saturday morning cartoon or after school cartoon with a neat pat little lesson. At least that always kind of gave me that impression. But in the movie, because there's more of an arc, there's more emotional resonance when Aladdin finally does free the genie. In addition, in the original animated classic, the genie, after he becomes free, versus the genie before he becomes free, it's like the same genie. He's still all-powerful. He's still omnipotent. And the movie actually ends with him basically touring the world or something, a few minutes or hours or whatever. He's still the genie, essentially, right? No change. It's just that he doesn't have the manacles on his wrists, and so he's free. That loses a little bit of the emotional resonance with me. And of course, the movie set up 2 sequels. It was tremendous. I told you it was tremendously popular. It made like hundreds of millions of dollars back in the 90s. So it was a huge hit. And so it set up 2 direct-to-video sequels. There was even a TV series. And you can tell that they wanted to keep the genie around because they wanted him as another character. He was basically another great cartoon character, and the genie carried the movie of Aladdin. So if you want to make more movies or TV series and the further adventures of Aladdin and Jasmine, you gotta have the genie. And so, and more importantly, you have to have the genie as the genie. But I think in the context of this movie, while, I mean, obviously, people think, oh, they're gonna make a sequel. I don't think that's how Disney works with the live action adaptations. If it makes $1 billion or it makes 100 million, I don't think they go to sequels. You can't make a sequel to Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty and the Beast was it was $1 billion movie. You can't really make a sequel to Beauty and the Beast. So I think the way Disney thinks is that, hey, if you love it, we've got 40 animated pictures in our vault. We'll make a live action adaptation of another one of those, maybe of Cruella de Vil. They're all in the cards. And that's their sequel. But a direct sequel, I think, is a lot trickier. And so when they make a movie, with some exceptions, like Maleficent 2 is maybe a little exception. It would be interesting to see if they can really do anything new with that. But in general, I don't think they make these movies or plot them out story-wise with sequels in mind. And so with that context, that means that they can afford to give you a resolution for the genie that makes more sense, which is that in the movie, in the live-action movie, for him to be truly set free from the lamp, he had to become fully human. And that's amazing. It's a very powerful theme, and you can find that theme throughout even the work of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where the half-elven, for instance, Arwen or Elrond, etc. They had to choose. Sorry for the diversion, but no, you had to choose. Do you want to be eternally beautiful, eternally young? You want to be immortal like the elves? Or do you want to choose the path of humanity and die of old age? But in so dying, you then reach a secret of the afterlife that no other being can divine except for human beings. So even though their lives are short, there's a beauty and a majesty to that as well. And so for the genie, it's a much better ending for him because it makes sense. Jafar sacrificed his humanity to become omnipotent. Again, the joke, right? All powerful, but in a little tiny living space, right? In the lamp. So he gave up his humanity, in essence, his soul, for all that power. But the flip side is he has to use that power never for himself, but for his masters, which, again, by the way, is a incredibly fitting, beautiful ending for a major Disney film. Like, finally, we don't have a Disney guy, basically falling off a bridge and falling to his or her death. This is a truly great ending for a villain, one of the best ones and the most fitting ones, right? And so it would make sense that Jafar sacrifices his humanity to get all that power, and then for the genie to essentially, he gives up his power. In the opposite story arc from Jafar, he gives up the all omnipotence, all powerful, to become just a human being, to live, to love, and then ultimately to die, but having lived something, having gained something more important than all the power in the universe. I think that's beautiful, and a beautiful ending. And so that, number one, huge improvement for me compared to the animated classic. And they use that to frame the movie. So instead of the animated classic, where it's just some street peddler telling the story, trying to sell you the lamp, it's Will Smith as a human being telling it to his kids, and talking about that, and how essentially it's like the genie's origin story. It's like how he became a husband and a father and a man from his past as a genie. So I love that. So number one, that was amazing. Number two, I did like the fact that they made Jafar a bit more interesting villain. I thought he was a really great villain even in the animated classic. The way they drew him was just so angular, so sinister. I mean, he scared the bejesus out of my 4.5-year-old. She could not actually watch the original animated classic with my 10-year-old. My 10-year-old was able to see it, but my 4-year-old, she could not. She was really scared by Jafar. So I thought Jafar as a character was really good. I thought his ending, like I discussed, where he eventually wound up in the lamp, was such an imaginative, amazing sort of story point. But in the movie, I think they made him a bit better, at least in my point of view. I think they made him more sinister. He was maybe a little bit less comical. I like the fact that they toned down Iago. Again, a large part of Aladdin, if you want to watch it again, it's the same as Cinderella. This is like, you feel like there's like a after-school cartoon cut with the main story. And I think that is a reflection of the sensibilities of maybe the audience at the time and what was expected of a quote unquote cartoon. There's a lot more pandering to kids. And I think Iago was just one of those characters that was a bit much. Again, it reminds me of like a Tom and Jerry cartoon sometimes. So they toned Iago way down, but he was a lot more sinister. Like, you know, I think a lot of people was like, really upset maybe, oh, I wish like Gilbert Gottfried was back in this, but it's like, no, he wouldn't have fit in this movie, The parrot was a lot more dangerous, a lot more sinister. You didn't laugh at the parrot's jokes very much. He was sort of a bona fide, villain's assistant, so to speak. And the Jafar in this movie was a little bit maybe less comical. I mean, it was like he was comical in the animated feature, but in the live action one, you really felt like, he meant business, So I liked the fact that they did that. They also gave a bit more backstory to him, not too much so, but they gave him some interesting tidbits. There were scenes with him and Aladdin where he showed Aladdin that he was a thief, just like him. He had the same sleight of hand, the same pickpocketing abilities, and you see Jafar almost sort of as a dark reflection of Aladdin. Like, if Aladdin was a darker person, a more evil person, maybe Jafar represented something that Aladdin might have turned into if he had gone down a darker road, which I liked that particular depth, to those two characters. And you get a more of a feel for Jafar's motivations, his anger, his pride, his ego, how he killed people, how he betrayed people to get to his position of power, how it just wasn't enough, and how he sort of had a Napoleonic complex. So like what set him off was being second, and the sort of person who was so hyper competitive because of his background that he was obsessed with always winning, obsessed with always being number one. How number two for him was basically as bad or even worse than being last, and all of that kind of played to his downfall because that particular type of obsession and was his character flaw, and that's what allowed him to be manipulated by Aladdin at the climax to talk him into that wish. And I think in the animated classic, that came off almost as a little cheap, or almost like a little tricky little thing. It was like, how does anybody fall for that? You got to be kidding me! When you first see it in the cartoon, it happened too quick. But when you understand Jafar's arc in this movie, you absolutely do buy why he would make that last wish to be the most powerful force in the universe, and they tied it in beautifully with his motivations that he was setting up. So that's an example of, in my opinion, really good writing. You have Chekhov's gun, and that gun was fired at the end of the movie. So I think Jafar's character was a real big improvement. A lot more sinister, a lot more dangerous, a lot more depth. And he steals the lamp from Aladdin at the end, versus Iago stealing it in the cartoon. And again, that ties back to what they had set up in the beginning. So really love that. So Genie's arc, great. Jafar's arc, great. Now, what makes the movie work, in addition, is there'll be two things that make it work. Number one, you got to love the genie, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. And then number two, you have to really be rooting for Aladdin and Jasmine. And so along those lines, even though they don't add too much more to Aladdin and Jasmine's character from the animated movie, they do a little bit, but the most important thing is that the actors portraying Aladdin, Mina Massoud and Naomi Scott, respectively, they have excellent chemistry. They're both really, really good-looking people, especially Naomi Scott, who's gorgeous. And on top of all of that, they're extremely likable. The way they portray the characters are really likable. And so from the very beginning, you really root for Aladdin, and that's like so critical for this story. So you absolutely like Aladdin, you root for him, you want him to succeed, you want him to dig himself out of the poverty that he finds himself into, and you love Jasmine, you love her character, you love her spunkiness, you love her independence, and so you root for these two people. They're very charismatic, and you root for them not only separately, but you root for them to be together. And I think that's a huge point for the movie to score, and they carry that off. Aladdin's arc is pretty much the same as before. I think Mina Massoud does a great job as Aladdin. And he's very believable. You know, you can see the kindness in him. You can also see the limitations that's brought about by his background. And some, again, this is a great script. You know, the story is good, the dialogue is good, and when he says something, he says that near the end, you know, he has to break his promise to the genie because he feels like he can't do it, and he tells the genie, he's like, people like me, we don't get good things unless we pretend. You know, like nothing is real for us because of the poverty and the background, and that kind of rang true. You know, because of the way Masood delivered those lines. So I think he did a fantastic job. I think for Jasmine and Naomi Scott, they gave her a little bit extra sort of girl power, which I thought was okay. You know, I think the way they sort of shoehorned it in might have been a little bit, maybe too much, maybe a little bit too clumsy. She has like a girl power song, both near the beginning and the end of the movie, that unfortunately does feel a bit forced. She breaks into this kind of defiant song, but she does it near a part of the movie that feels unnaturally shoehorned in. She's being told to just shut up, which is, that's the way it is back in that culture at that time. Women were meant to be seen and not heard. That's historically, accurate, even in the United States. That's the way it was. And she's sort of, rebelling against that. But it's near the end when she's supposed to be taken away to the dungeons or something like that in chains, and then in her head, she sort of kind of turns it on and it shows this musical number, but it goes on for a little bit too long, and it just seems a little bit jarring, out of place within the flow of the story. And so I think that song would have been better served maybe in a different place, but I can see where they had a hard time sort of fitting it in. But if that's the case, maybe you should just maybe cut it, because I don't think that it was the right place for her to sing that particular song. Or if she wanted to sort of do what she did, which is basically to speak up, she should have just done it. And we didn't need like a 2-minute like breaking out song, even though it was great for Naomi Scott, because it is one of those great Broadway style bring down the house type solo numbers. Within the context of the story, unfortunately, it probably should have been cut. So there you have my analysis of Aladdin and Jasmine's relationship. And again, the courting, the carpet ride, all of that was great. And now we come to the Sultan, who they portrayed as a bumbling idiot in the cartoon. This little fat, short, essentially moron. And I'm really glad that they didn't do that. They gave the Sultan a lot more gravitas. They made it believable that he would be, the leader of the Agrabah, and just being taken advantage of by a very evil, powerful sorcerer. And so I like that change too. Again, all the changes so far that I see in the movie, in my mind, was an improvement. Made things better, deeper. All the things like I told you in the beginning of this review that I want from a live action adaptation. So the Sultan, definite improvement. They added a handmaid to Jasmine. Why would you need that? Well, because in a lot of Disney films, there's no females. I mean, if you really want to look back at this, there's not a lot of very strong female characters. And in Aladdin, there was just basically Jasmine, like the only woman in the entire, it seems, in the Agrabah. So they added her handmaiden to, I think, give another female character. And in my opinion, that was much needed. A lot of times when you add, characters that weren't in the original animated feature, it weakens things. But in this case, it made it stronger. It was another person that Jasmine could play off of. I thought she was really important, and she wound up being she wound up being the love interest for the genie. And eventually, when the genie becomes human, he marries her and has a life with her. And I thought that was a very, very good framing device. So that added character was very, very good. So we finally come down to the genie himself. How was Will Smith? I think by and large, he was fantastic. Again, this movie fails or succeeds based on the genie and based on Aladdin and Jasmine's relationship. So Will Smith really brought it home. The thing about Will Smith, I have to understand, is he's had his ups and downs. And I've seen some of his horrible movies. The reason this guy is who he is, and the reason he was such a huge international movie star, and one of the few African-American, movie stars, up there with Denzel and all that, is because he is just tremendously charismatic, and he's just tremendously likable. And they played to his strengths for that, fortunately. They also didn't destroy a lot of it with makeup and special effects. I think that whenever he's the blue genie, it's more of a challenge because it's just really hard, I think, to make a blue genie look reasonable. I mean, I think when you do a cartoon, you can make him anything. He could be blue, green, neon, whatever. You can make it work because it's a cartoon. And when you're in the world of the cartoon, I think suspension of disbelief is sort of built into our brains when we're seeing a cartoon. But when we're seeing like a live action adaptation, these standards are a lot higher. And I think the blue stuff doesn't really work as well. It makes it look kind of laughable. And so they do adjust the story. So they have Will Smith as Will Smith in a lot more of the picture. So he isn't just like this blue character, you know. And I think that is like really, really important to do. But I think he got a lot of flack because, you know, the effects didn't look very good. And again, there's always that little comparison to Robin Williams, and it's easy to sort of compare and judge him when you're seeing him in like a 1 minute, 30-second or 2 minute trailer. But when you see him over the course of the entire movie, you appreciate the change to his story arc that the movie made that I mentioned. And then you see what Will Smith is crafting as his own particular genie and that personality. I think it does work. It works without essentially having to replicate or recreate Robin Williams' version. I mean, Robin Williams' genie is basically like this zany character who just snorted like 8 lines of cocaine. And he's just like nonstop, like Looney Tunes off the wall, right? With a bit of heart. And Will Smith really, I think, he goes a whole different direction. He downplays that. He has, again, a little bit more of that. You know, he brings a little bit more like the hood, you know, the hood version of the genie with some of his jokes. He basically plays Will Smith, the genie, and that's actually perfectly fine because, again, you really like Will Smith, and it's one of those things that that plays very well and that works. And like you're rooting for Will Smith too. You're rooting for the genie as well, which is why everything works so well. Like, you know, you want the genie to succeed. You want Aladdin and Jasmine to get together. And I think that's again a big compliment to what Will Smith was able to do with the character and how he sells the character as well. And to overcome the limitation, you know, of Robin Williams' shadow is a pretty big accomplishment. So that all worked out. In terms of the songs, you know, they have essentially all the songs, maybe a little bit different here or there. But the blockbusters, which is, you know, Friend Like Me, Prince Ali, A Whole New World, of course, even Arabian Nights, all delivered very, very well. One of the nitpicks of the movie, which I mentioned before, is that one of the songs called, what is it called, Silence or something like that? I think it's called Silence, or it has to do with just, you know, Jasmine not being able to talk because of the sexism of that time. I think it's a great song. I just think that it was misplaced. So that didn't work too well. And the other aspect of the music is, while it is, of course, iconic music, the big problem is that then Will Smith has to sing them. And this is a problem because the sort of songs that Howard Ashman wrote wasn't really meant for Will Smith to do well in. And he doesn't have the same projection that Robin Williams does. And so when he sings the songs, he kind of has to sing them because, I mean, what can I say? It's like, you know, A Friend Like Me, Prince Ali, those were all like, you know, they're kind of like the pillars of this movie, right? They're essentially legendary songs. You have to sing them. You can't cut them out. So Will Smith sang them, and while he's not awful, he is, you know, just kind of average. And I think in those instances where you kind of really miss Robin Williams the most is because you're missing, ironically, the singing voice. So I think the singing by Will Smith is a little bit off. I mean, again, when he first turns around and starts singing Arabian Nights, you're used to hearing Arabian Nights from this really deep voice from the cartoon. And then when Will Smith kind of does his little nasally, you know, Arabian Nights, like if he does that, like, you know, you kind of like laugh. It just elicits this, like, you know, laughter from you because it just sounds so weak. So I think that's one of the things about the movie, one of the nitpicks is that, Will Smith essentially is forced to sing songs that he is painfully, I feel, and obviously incapable of hitting that. And I do wonder if maybe it would have been better to just kind of sub his voice. It's hard to say whether that would have worked in the favor of the movie or not. Okay, so there's that with the music. And then finally, in terms of the cinematography and the effects, the movie's gorgeous. Jasmine has multiple costumes throughout that are breathtaking. If you like I said, you enjoy buying dolls of the various princesses from the live action movies, she definitely has a couple of costumes that are just mind blowing. Because it's a live action movie, they're able to show you details of Agrabah that gives you a sense of the immensity of the city. The cartoon is not able to do that. I think this movie is able to do that because of the live action aspect of it. And again, the gold, the jewels, the treasure, the opulence of the palace, and of course Jasmine, her tiger Raja, they're all just done so magnificently and in a way that, again, a cartoon or animated picture cannot approach. There's this one scene early on when she's coming down to meet, one of the random princes, one of her suitors, and she just comes in down the stairs in red with a tiger and her handmaid behind her, and it's like a definite, like, oh wow moment, because again, Naomi Scott's very beautiful. She's dressed perfectly. She's coming down. There's a train behind her of this red. The tiger's like, it is crazy. I think you see a few seconds of it in the trailer, but you see the entire thing in the movie, and it's definitely one of the oh wow moments of the movie. So I think based on that, and it goes all the way through, it definitely takes advantage, I think, of showing the beauty of the cultural background of that story, the Middle East, Agrabah, that particular type of dress and costume. Does a great job. No complaints there. And so I think in conclusion, that's why I'm kind of going on so much about the movie is I actually put it right behind Cinderella in terms of my favorite live action movies. And it kills me to say this as a huge Beauty and the Beast fan, but I just feel like the Beauty and the Beast adaptation was maybe a little bit too slavish to the original. Not quite the same, didn't quite pull off the household objects quite as well. But this movie was just so strong. I think it's behind Cinderella just a little bit because Cinderella is that live action version was just so magical. And it really, I think Sandy Powell got robbed of her third Oscar. They gave it to Mad Max, Fury Road. Okay, the less said about that, the better. But the fact that Cinderella, with all the story improvements and the opulence of the dress, that magical, ball that she goes to, it just kind of puts it right above Aladdin. But Aladdin's really close because there's more humor and a little bit more heart. When at the very end when the genie, you can tell that the genie loves Aladdin so much and has become his friend, and he's willing to give up his freedom because he just assumes he wants Aladdin to be happy. He's so selfless, he's willing to make Aladdin, that last wish he wants to give to Aladdin to make Aladdin good, to give him the prince, to give him everything that Aladdin deserves in life. And then for Aladdin to give all of that up back at the genie and to set it free and to see Will Smith's reaction, I mean, it does make you a little bit, it's more emotional than you would think. And it can make you a little bit misty-eyed. And it made me a little bit misty-eyed, surprisingly so, just because of the emotion of that. And that was something that the cartoon just does as a throwaway. It's like a throwaway line, a throwaway ending. And the movie gives you such emotional resonance. So I think this movie has a lot of heart, and I would put it 1B to Cinderella's 1A. And so this is definitely one of Disney's best live action adaptations. Shocking, because your expectations were not the highest. My expectations were not the highest after seeing the trailers. But I can definitely see why the audience score would be an A cinema score and would be 94+% on Rotten Tomatoes. and I think that this movie is going to do better with word of mouth. I'm certainly going to tell people to see it. I think it's amazing. I wouldn't mind watching it again. It's definitely a worthy, worthy live action update. And I started the review by telling you everything I want in a live action update. And this movie, if you follow this whole review, you can appreciate it does every single thing I wanted, and it does it exceptionally well. Right up there with Cinderella as the best live action adaptation of a Disney animated picture, one of my favorites. So looking forward to The Lion King, because I really enjoyed Jon Favreau's Jungle Book adaptation, which hit much of the same points for me. But please check out Aladdin, because you won't be disappointed. Definitely one of the better films I've seen all year. So thanks for listening to me all this time, and I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on Aladdin. Please check it out. Watch it on IMAX, because watch on the biggest screen you can, because there's a lot of wonderful effects and action sequences, beautiful shots. If you're going to appreciate it on the big screen, go for broke. Go see it on IMAX. And until next time, do take care.